Hi, Jenny. We're here to do another astrobiography. Who are we talking about today?
Cool. Hi, Laurie. We're just going to bite the bullet and talk about Princess Diana. So everybody does Princess Diana. Well, this time it's our turn.
Yeah, I figure we had to go there eventually, right? And I have to say, before we say anything about Princess Diana's chart, that watching the documentary that I watched, which was a PBS documentary, there's a whole series called In Their Voice. I think that's what it is. And there was one on her. It's just an hour-long documentary. It was really great. And I always had a negative attitude toward Princess Diana. Maybe because everyone else loved her so much, I just didn't. But watching this documentary with this chart really, as it always does with charts, as soon as I've got someone's chart in my hands to kind of explain the story of their life, it just opens your heart to who that person really is and their struggles and the reality of who they are. So as I always do when I work with a chart, I fall in love with the person. And now I think Princess Diana is just an amazing human being. Was an amazing human being.
Yeah, it is interesting what perspective astrology can provide. For me, I was born in England, and I have my family is remarkably completely disinterested in anything to do with the royal family. Nonetheless, I do remember that I was in England at the summer of her wedding, and just kind of checking it out. And I don't remember having any particularly strong feelings about it, but it was a very sort of fairy tale type of wedding that was on television. And I don't know, I got more interested in her later. I think that movie, The Queen, came out, which kind of had the Queen's reaction to Diana's death, which is a pretty interesting movie. It's not a documentary, just a movie. And then I also watched the same thing you did, in their own words series of hearing. And so somewhere along the way was some recordings of actual interviews with Diana and her just intense misery and struggle with being in the royal family. So
there's a lot of documentaries out there about her. And if you've got her chart in your hands and watch any of them, you're going to learn a lot about her and a lot about astrology. So without further ado, let's open up that chart.
Do it.
And what we're going to do today, which we've started doing with these astrobiographies, is just trying to, we could just riff on this and go crazy and talk about it for hours. But we're trying to tighten it up and keep it focused in a few certain areas, just to keep it, just giving you a bite-sized taste of how to look at a famous person's chart. So we're going to start with our first pass here is going to be looking at the midheaven. The midheaven always will tell us, if we're talking about a famous person, the story of what you see from the perspective of looking at a famous person is going to be shown through the midheaven itself. So with Diana's chart, her midheaven falls in the 11th house using whole sign house system. So, in whole sign house system, the midheaven and the ascendant become floating points. They are not attached to the cusp of any house. So with the midheaven falling in her 11th house, what does that tell you?
Well, it brings in the topics of the 11th house to her, the midheaven being the highest point. So in other words, groups, community, looking at aspirations and hopes or other designations of the 11th house, and letting other people love you.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think of that so much with if you think of the 11th house as the community that gives you love, I think of the polarity between the 5th and the 11th, as the 5th is where we give love, the 11th is where we receive love. And Libra here, ruled by Venus in Taurus, and she was perceived by the largest community as this incredibly beautiful princess. That's how she was seen. She was seen very much through that filter of that lovely Venus in Taurus. That's how we all saw her when we watched her becoming a princess at that fairy tale princess wedding that you talked about, which incidentally, and this is an aside, but for those of you who understand this, at the time of her wedding, Pluto was exactly conjunct that midheaven. So that was a transformation into this position of great beauty and value.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pretty incredible.
Yes, it's really interesting thinking about Venus and Taurus ruling that, because the next thing, or one of the next things you might want to do is go, well, what condition was Venus in? If Venus is ruling that midheaven and showing this kind of fairy tale wedding at that time, what is really happening to Venus? And Venus is under a great deal of pressure in this chart. It's squared by Uranus, and it's squared by Mars. So I just want to bring it up so you just kind of can cue, okay, Venus is really stressed. So what else is going on? And for those of you who know the story, there was a lot going on, that her being in this fairy tale princess position was actually a prison for her. It was awful for her in so many ways. She was extremely isolated. She felt just not spoken to, she wasn't talked to. I mean, it was just a really, really awful time for her. So look at all that stress. I mean, that is one stressed out Venus.
Yeah, that is a highly stressed Venus. And from the perspective of most of us, we didn't see the stress. We just saw that vision of beauty. Eventually, the stress did start coming forth, and we did start seeing that. But that's pretty intense. Is there anything else about the midheaven itself? Well, I mean, you think about how she was seen by the public, first as just that princess, and then as it opened, she was seen as the mother of these two boys. She was seen as the humanitarian, which would bring in that Uranus, and the actions that she took of Mars. So yeah, how we saw her did not get stuck at that position of the wedding. We did see her take on incredible humanitarian causes and do a lot of really serious work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was more to it than just that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things to think about with a square aspect. Any square aspect in a chart, yes, it's a struggle and it's hard. And okay, so she felt imprisoned, but the square demands action and change. So she took that stress and she spun it into the humanitarian causes that she really attached herself to. So she did her work. She really did.
She did. And I mean, also just for those of you, learning astrology and looking at this Venus, I mean, what you are looking at the T-square with Venus being squared by two other planets that are opposing each other. And what this means is that Venus is particularly important to navigating that very stressful configuration. So it's whatever she does with that Venus is what allows her to evolve in her career from that perspective. And it's the stress, it must grow or it can't really survive. So that's what we're looking at. Which kind of segues us into the next part, which is, well, and for one thing, talking about the moon. So
right. So let's look at the next part. The second piece that we're going to talk about is just the sun, moon, rising sign. Thinking about it through archetypes is one really great way to think about this. So first of all, let's just highlight her sun is in Cancer, her moon is in Aquarius, and she's got Sagittarius rising. Now, in the simplest terms, I always do this little make the sentence with the archetypes. I think it came from a Stephen Forrest book I read about 50 years ago. But, if you just take that and think about it, we would make a simple sentence of, she is the nurturer with the heart of the revolutionary, wearing the mask of the explorer. There's other archetypes you could use, but that's one simple way to think about it. But then you think deeper into that, and what do you bump into, Jennie?
Into the archetypes?
Well, however you think about these three, how do they work together? How efficient and effectively are they going to work together?
Well, it's really interesting because they're pretty different, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have a mutable rising sign, you have a fixed moon sign, and you have a cardinal sun sign. So, I mean, they're quite different.
Right.
You also have three different elements. You've got water,
Right.
you've got air, you've got fire.
Yeah.
I think what's notable about her chart is that she doesn't really have much else in the way of fire. Like she's got, there isn't much there. There's more emphasis on the water, actually water, air, and earth. But so kind of it's a reach for her to reach towards that Sagittarius. Like she doesn't have a natural affinity for fire. So that's
Right.
one aspect, or one way of looking at it.
That's interesting to think of it that way. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. Her lack of fire. I hadn't really thought about her lack of fire, but she really doesn't. The only planet she has in fire is an outer planet. So she doesn't have any real access to, that passionate motion forward.
Yeah.
Interesting. Where she picks up on some of that drive is, clearly her Mars placement and that opposition from Uranus. She's really, really driven toward the humanitarian efforts, which was not a welcome thing in the family she ended up in after her marriage. That's for sure.
Yeah.
They wanted her to stay home and keep her mouth shut.
Yeah. I know, and it's interesting because the moon is in the third house, and that is not the moon. That is a chatty position. That is a need to use one's voice to speak up, and in her case, to speak up for people who didn't have as much of a voice. She had a really intense focus on children, particularly children that were suffering a lot. That she works later on in her life.
Yeah, which you can see. Yeah, you can see where that connects to her own suffering as a child with Chiron in the fourth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always interesting to me when I see the sun in Cancer and the moon in Aquarius. It is such a interesting combination because the sun in Cancer is ruled by that moon in Aquarius, but the moon in Aquarius is not nurturing and lovey like Cancer wants to be. It's very cool and detached and intellectual. So we were talking before we started making the recording, Jennie and I were talking about one of the things that is really difficult for me to fit into looking at the chart when I watch these documentaries and read what people say about her. There's all the conversation about what an awesome mother she was, how she didn't want the nannies raising her children. She was going to raise her children. And there's all kinds of pictures of her cuddling and loving her children. Moon in Aquarius is not a warm, cuddly mom. It's just not. But when we look a little deeper and think about it, her Jupiter being retrograde, I think is really important too. Her perspective on so many things, on where her ideas expand, is very much going to go in a different direction than what is expected. It almost feels as though that the great mother that she taught herself to be was not so much a natural outpouring of herself, but a revolutionary act. She was not mothered. She lost her mother basically when she was 6, 7 years old, something like that. And she had very disagreeable stepmother. I think her good mothering was actually a revolutionary act.
Yeah. And I just want to add in here to sort of underscore what Laurie's saying. First of all, you can see with Moon in Aquarius and opposing Uranus, that's two ways of saying the same thing. Both of those speak to a disconnection, especially as a child, a way in which mothering ceased at a certain point in her life, leaving her child self feeling alone, abandoned, not nurtured. And then, married into this royal family where that pattern continued, alone, not being nurtured, right? Not being heard. So that's another way of, like, when you see that Uranus, you see the Moon in Aquarius, you go, okay, there's a disconnection here that happened in childhood. The second thing I see that underscores some of what Laurie's saying, this idea of mothering is a revolutionary act. Well, she's got Sun in Cancer. Cancer is nurturing. Cancer is a sign of the mother. She also has Mercury retrograde in Cancer near that Sun. And whenever you see that Mercury retrograde, one thing to cue into is and ask is there a second agenda? So the second agenda of, like, I'm not just nurturing my child, being this wonderful Sun in Cancer loving mother, but I'm also saying, nope, I'm doing this as a revolutionary act. I have a different agenda. There's a second agenda. So that's just something to tune into with Mercury retrograde that can be helpful.
Yeah. And it's also, it extends out because, as you said before, an awfully lot of her humanitarian work, or maybe all of her humanitarian work, was for the benefit of children. So there was this revolutionary supporting of young people. It's
And part of what was so radical too later, I remember seeing this in the documentary, is that she visits there's children that she visits with HIV and AIDS. There's children with leprosy. There's children in America who've been suffering. There's children in Africa, there's in India, all these different places, Pakistan. And in all of this, she's willing to, like, hug and hold these children. And she's this, like, princess, so she really breaks the barrier by doing that. And I think that's why she's become such an elevated figure, because she broke these barriers between the sort of upper crust royalty and then the need for just simply caring for these children that are suffering in all these different ways. That is a total revolutionary act to the royal family against them. Awesome.
It really is. It's an amazing chart. Okay. We kind of drifted quite a bit from our three main points, but I think we got what we needed to, right? I guess I did want to, I mentioned that Jupiter being retrograde as part of the, the beliefs being very different than what was expected in the context of her life and others around her, and just the fact that rules her ascendant. I think that's really important to just kind of note that, and that it is in that third house. She was not going to keep those different belief systems to herself. She had to speak about them. She had to bring that forth. So I think that's an important piece as well. Okay, so the next thing, now we've talked about the midheaven as far as, how the world knew her. And now we've gone and we probably already have kind of covered this, but the third point was, how do her friends know her? How do her friends know her? When they meet her, what do they meet? They meet that expansive side of
that jovial, like, spark, which definitely shows up, I think, in the documentary, of, like, this kind of somebody's a little different and is adventurous and is going to end up in an amazing place. I mean, that's what it seems like earlier on.
And that, again, is ruled by that retrograde Jupiter. She's, her friends probably know her quirky side, her more, more expansive ideas about the world. I don't think that royal family didn't have a clue what they were getting. And neither did she, They all just kind of,
Oh, sorry, Laurie, go ahead.
No, that's all right. I was just babbling.
I got excited, like, I was just thinking that a key phrase is kind of like going against the grain with that Aquarius, like going against the grain, people who know her seeing that and witnessing that, maybe even her siblings witnessing that. No, you know, I'm not quite sure if she threw her sister under the bus or if it just happened naturally, because her sister had been dating Prince Charles, or maybe she saved her sister from going under the bus. I can't decide which.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing, is that, yeah, her sister was dating him, and given that third house piece, that's an interesting part that we don't know the full story of, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of covers it. Do you want to talk also about the nodal axis here, Jenny? Because
Yeah,
that's pretty hard to not see it.
Yeah, and you had mentioned that as like an additional piece to start bringing into these videos, and I think that's great. And this one's actually really easy to do it because it's going to underscore themes that we already have touched on. So, you know, the moon is conjunct the south node in Aquarius. The south node, I mean, there's some controversy as to what that represents, but I think the way you and I both tend to use it is, or at least one of the ways, is that it can represent somewhat of regressive tendencies, like things that you do that are comfortable but maybe no longer serve you, some of those. So having the moon next to the south node, it suggests to me this idea of like her having to work really hard to break out of the regressive tendencies of her childhood, of sort of to just be isolated and to not find ways to break through that. But I don't know if you want to add to that, or
well, there's a lot of ways to look at it. You know, you can look at the nodal axis from the perspective of past lifetimes, or, you know, many ways. But you can think of, you know, she came into the world, she started out as a child in this, she didn't have a mother. You know, there was a cold detachment, there was a separation from the mother, and the movement forward in life brings her to a place of bringing warmth out into the world in a very humanitarian way, with it conjunct that Uranus. I think it just really speaks very directly to the path of her life. And then is there anything else you want to say before I go on to the and then?
No, go on to the and then.
Okay, the and then comes in my mind, you know, she's moving toward this direction. She's out there, she's doing really important work, shining her light, that Leo generosity, that generous nature, where, yeah, she's hugging on those AIDS patients when nobody would even be in the room with them. And then we've got Mars and Pluto. And I just look at that Mars and Pluto right there at the top of the chart, and all I can see is the crash of her death.
Her fiery death. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, that's a very prominent, incredibly powerful clash that's quite public.
Yeah. And you're making me think too, like when you start seeing the intermix of these the personal planets with the outer planets, so in this particular case Mars and Pluto together, it often shows an intersection of that person's personal life into a very public display, or a way that is contending with the symbols of the outer planets as society. And she has a lot of those types of contexts in her chart. But just to say, like, Mars Pluto isn't always going to be a fiery car crash, but in the 10th house and in this chart and in the way the stress of the configuration is part of all those things, it does suggest it's easy to see it like that.
Yeah, you know, I something else just jumped out at me, and it might be a little silly, but I'm thinking about the fact that Mars rules Aries, and Aries is the 5th house. And, you know, thinking about her mothering as you know, she gave birth to very powerful men. You know, this is a public statement of empowerment as well. And I mean, I don't know, you know, what will end up. Is one of her sons going to end up being king. I don't know, but looking at this, I think that's a statement of the children that she did bring into the world being both male children and this incredible public power that they hold. I think that's just part of that statement as well.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
The many faces of the astrological symbols.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to kind of play with it this way.
Yeah.
So I think that covered everything I wanted to cover. How about you?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I mean, this is a great chart to look at. There's a lot of different things that pop out. Like you said, we could go on and on, but I think that's a pretty good summary of her chart. And you don't need to go crazy on all the symbols because we did keep it pretty tight, actually. Midheaven, we addressed the sun and the moon, and then moved to this, and we got a lot out of it. So
it's fascinating to look. You know, famous people's charts are powerful charts. That's you're when I look through my client base, you know, you see some super powerful charts, but most people's charts are a little calmer than famous people's charts.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Luckily, we don't have to go through. This is probably, you know, here's another thing that just jumped into my mind. That Pluto and Mars right there in the 10th house probably also speaks a lot to the paparazzi, that kind of thing. Just what she, you know, the powerful discord that she had to face in the outer world in so many ways. Yeah.
Well, the other thing, I'll just say this one other thing. It occurs to me is, I know there's all kinds of different conspiracy theories about how she died and this and that. And maybe she just died in a car crash. Maybe there was more diabolical things behind it. But whatever, nonetheless, because her death kind of elevated her in a way. It kind of elevated her to it's almost like a martyr or sacrificial component to this chart. I feel that her death kind of changed. I mean, forever cemented her image in the minds of the public in this different way that may not have quite been the same. So I don't know.
That is very interesting. All right. Are we wrapping? Is it a wrap?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. And we'll do another one soon. If anyone wants to give us recommendations who they'd like to see us do, we will take them under consideration. We kind of have little lists that we work with to make decisions. So anyway, you can find Jenny at hiddenpathastrology.com. You can find me at astrolore.org. Thank you. Contact us for teaching or consultations. Okay. Have a great day.
Bye.